It was a bright, sunny morning at Westview Middle School. The birds were chirping happily in the trees, and kids were running around, laughing and shouting as they played. The school gates creaked open, and 13-year-old Tony Russo walked in. He didn't look special at all. His black hair was messy, sticking up in all directions like he just rolled out of bed. He wore an old, faded hoodie that was a little too big for him, and his sneakers had holes in them, showing his socks underneath. To everyone else, Tony was just a regular kid, someone they didn't even notice most of the time. He was the quiet type, the boy who sat alone at lunch, munching on his sandwich while others ignored him. He never talked much, never caused trouble, and never fought back when someone teased him. But here's the big secret: Tony wasn't just any kid. Oh no. He was hiding something huge, something so wild it could turn the whole town upside down. Behind those shy, dark eyes and that patched up hoodie was a truth no one could guess. Not the teachers who called his name in class. Not the students who passed him in the halls. And definitely not the bullies who were about to mess with the wrong guy. Tony's secret was like a bomb waiting to go off, and nobody had a clue, not yet. The school day started like always. Kids ran to their lockers, slamming them shut with loud bangs. The bell rang, sharp and loud, telling everyone to hurry to class. Tony shuffled along, his backpack bouncing on his shoulders. He kept his head down, staring at the ground like he didn't want anyone to look at him. Most kids didn't bother. They were too busy talking about video games or what they watched on TV last night. To them, Tony was boring. Invisible. Just a loner who didn't matter. But then, a loud voice cut through the noise. "Hey, you. What's with the goofy walk, Russo?" it shouted. Heads turned. Kids stopped talking. Everyone knew that voice. It was Jake Miller, the biggest, meanest kid in 7th grade. Jake was tall, with spiky blonde hair and a grin that made you nervous. He acted like he owned the school, like he was the king and everyone else had to listen to him. He loved picking on smaller kids, laughing when they got mad or scared. And today, his eyes were locked on Tony. Jake stood there, arms crossed, smirking like he'd just found his next target. His friends stood behind him, giggling and whispering. They were like a pack of wolves, following their leader. "Look at him, waddling like a duck," Jake said, pointing at Tony. His voice was loud, echoing across the schoolyard. A few kids laughed. Others just watched, waiting to see what would happen. Jake took a step closer, his sneakers crunching on the gravel. "What's wrong, Russo?" "Too scared to say hi," he teased. Tony didn't stop walking. He didn't look up. He just kept moving, his hands stuffed in his pockets. His messy hair flopped over his eyes, hiding his face. Most people would think he was ignoring Jake because he was afraid. Maybe they'd think he was weak, too shy to stand up for himself. But if you looked really close, like, super close, you'd see something else. A tiny smirk. Just a little curve at the corner of his mouth. It wasn't big. You could miss it if you blinked. But it was there, and it said something loud and clear: "Keep talking, Jake. You're gonna regret it." Jake didn't see the smirk. He was too busy laughing, too busy showing off for his friends. "Ah, look. He's running away," he yelled. His buddies howled with laughter, slapping each other on the back. To them, Tony was a nobody, just a quiet kid they could push around. They didn't know he was counting every word they said. They didn't know he was watching them, waiting for the perfect moment. The truth was, Tony wasn't scared. Not even a little. He'd dealt with worse things than Jake Miller and his dumb jokes. Back home, away from school, Tony's life was different. Way different. His dad wasn't just some regular guy who worked in an office or drove a truck. No, his dad was someone big. Someone dangerous. Someone people whispered about in town but never dared to mess with. Tony didn't tell anyone about it, though. He didn't brag or show off. He kept it locked up tight, like a treasure chest buried deep underground. Hey, viewer. I say, breaking in for a second. Before we go on, drop a quick comment below. Where are you watching from today? And if you like stories with big surprises, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what's coming. Here's a question for you: have you ever known someone who seemed quiet but turned out to be super cool? Tell me about it. Okay, back to the story. That morning, As Tony walked into school, he didn't look like a hero. He didn't look like someone who could scare Jake Miller or anyone else. He just looked normal. Plain. Like a kid who'd rather read a book than start a fight. But that's what made this so exciting. The kids laughing at him. The teachers ignoring him. The bullies picking on him. None of them had any idea what was coming. Picture this, Westview Middle School was a big place. It had red brick walls, tall windows, and a playground with swings that squeaked when you rode them. The hall smelled like old books and cafeteria pizza. Kids ran everywhere, yelling about recess or trading snacks. It was loud and busy, and Tony blended right in. He didn't stand out. He didn't want to. Not yet. But Jake? Jake loved standing out. He strutted around like he was the boss of everything. He'd shove kids out of his way, steal their pencils just for fun, and laugh when they got upset. He thought he was untouchable. And when he saw Tony that morning, he decided it was time to have some fun. "Hey, Russo," he called again, jogging to catch up. "What's in that bag?" "More trash." He grabbed at Tony's backpack, yanking it off his shoulder. It hit the ground with a thud, spilling a notebook and a beat-up pencil case. Tony stopped. He turned around slowly, like he had all the time in the world. His dark eyes flicked up to Jake's face. For a second, they just stared at each other. Jake grinned, expecting Tony to cry or run away. But Tony didn't. He bent down, picked up his stuff, and shoved it back in his bag. "You're funny," he said quietly. His voice was soft, almost too soft to hear. Jake blinked, confused. "What'd you say?" he snapped. Tony zipped his bag shut and stood up. "I said, you're funny," he repeated, a little louder this time. Then he turned and walked away. Jake stood there, his mouth open. His friends stopped laughing. Something about Tony's voice, calm, steady, not scared at all, made them feel weird. Jake shook it off, though. "Whatever, loser," he yelled after him. But deep down, he didn't feel so sure anymore. And that's where it all started. One sunny morning, one mean bully, and one quiet kid with a secret bigger than anyone could imagine. Tony Russo wasn't just walking into school that day. He was walking into a story that would change everything. Stick around, because you won't believe what happens next. Lunchtime at Westview Middle School was loud and crazy. Kids ran around with trays of food, pizza, apples, little milk cartons, laughing and yelling over each other. The cafeteria smelled like fries and spilled juice. Long tables stretched across the room, packed with students trading snacks or telling jokes. It was the busiest part of the day, and Jake Miller loved it. For him, lunch was the perfect time to show everyone who was boss. And today, his target was Tony Russo. Jake and his crew didn't wait long to start trouble. Tony was sitting alone, like always, at the end of a table. His backpack sat next to him, patched up and worn out from being tossed around. Jake strutted over, his spiky blonde hair bouncing as he walked. His friends followed close behind, grinning like they knew something fun was about to happen. Without a word, Jake grabbed Tony's backpack right off the bench. "What's this junk?" he said, holding it up high so everyone could see. Then, with a big laugh, he tossed it straight into the trash can. It landed with a loud thunk, right on top of some leftover ketchup packets and soggy napkins. "Oops," Jake said, pretending it was an accident. He turned to his friends and high-fived them, his hand smacking theirs loud enough to echo. "Guess the loser's gotta dig for it now," he shouted. His buddies cracked up, pointing at Tony and slapping the table. Other kids nearby snickered too, covering their mouths as they watched. To them, Tony was just the quiet kid, the one who never fought back, the one who made an easy target. They thought he was weak, like a little mouse caught in a trap. But Tony didn't freak out. He didn't yell or cry or run to the teacher like they all expected. Instead, he stood up slowly, walked over to the trash can, and reached in. His hands got a little sticky from the ketchup, but he didn't care. He pulled his backpack out, shook it off, and wiped the red stains on his jeans. Then he sat back down, calm as ever, and kept eating his sandwich. The kids around him stopped laughing for a second, confused. Why wasn't he mad? Why didn't he do something? But soon, they shrugged and went back to their food. To them, Tony was still nothing special, just a weirdo who didn't know how to stand up for himself. Here's the thing, though, Tony wasn't weak. Not even a little bit. He wasn't scared or sad or helpless. Every time Jake shoved him in the hall, every time someone called him a name, every time the cafeteria laughed at him, he remembered it. He didn't forget a single thing. His brain was like a notebook, writing down every mean word and every dumb joke. But he didn't show it. He didn't let them see how smart he was, how strong he was inside. Instead, he watched them. He listened to every snicker and every brag. And deep down, in a quiet part of his mind, he was counting. Counting the seconds, the minutes, the days until everything would flip upside down. Jake didn't know any of this. He thought he was winning. He thought Tony was just a punching bag, a kid he could push around forever. A few days later, it got worse. Jake saw Tony in the hallway, carrying a stack of books to class. The hall was full of kids, bumping into each other as they hurried to their rooms. Jake grinned and stuck out his foot. Tony didn't see it in time. He tripped, and his books flew everywhere, sliding across the shiny floor. Kids laughed again, pointing as Tony scrambled to pick them up. "Nice moves, Russo," Jake called out, leaning against a locker with his arms crossed. "You're such a klutz." Tony didn't say anything. He just grabbed his books, one by one, and stacked them back up. His face didn't turn red. His eyes didn't get watery. He just kept going, like nothing happened. But if you looked close, you'd see his hands tighten around those books, just for a second. He wasn't mad yet, not on the outside. He was waiting. Another day, Jake took it even further. It was recess, and the playground was full of kids swinging on the monkey bars or kicking a soccer ball. Tony stood off to the side, watching the clouds move across the sky. Jake marched over, his sneakers stomping the grass. "Hey, Russo," he yelled, loud enough for everyone to hear. "What's wrong with you? Too scared to play with the big kids?" He leaned in close, his face just inches from Tony's. His breath smelled like the gum he'd been chewing all morning. "You're nothing, you know that." "Nothing." Tony didn't move. He didn't step back or flinch. He just looked up at Jake, his dark eyes sharp and steady, like little arrows. "We'll see," he muttered. His voice was so quiet, so soft, that Jake didn't even hear it. The wind carried the words away before they reached him. But something about Tony's look, the way he didn't blink, the way he stood so still, made Jake's stomach twist. Just for a second, he felt weird. Nervous, maybe. Like something wasn't right. But then he shook it off and laughed again. "Whatever, freak," he said, turning back to his friends. "He's not worth it." Jake's crew nodded, chuckling as they walked away. They didn't think twice about Tony. To them, he was still the same old loser, the kid they could mess with whenever they wanted. But they didn't know what Tony knew. They didn't see what he saw. Every time they laughed, every time they pushed him, they were digging a hole for themselves. A big, deep hole they wouldn't climb out of so easily. Tony went back to his spot by the fence, leaning against it with his hands in his pockets. He watched Jake run off, shouting and high-fiving like he owned the world. Tony's face didn't change. He didn't smile or frown. But inside, he was buzzing. He could feel it, the moment was coming. Not today, not tomorrow, but soon. All the shoves, all the insults, all the times they called him weak, it was building up to something huge. Something Jake couldn't stop, no matter how big or loud he was. The bell rang, and recess ended. Kids raced back inside, their voices bouncing off the walls. Tony picked up his backpack, the same one Jake had thrown in the trash, and slung it over his shoulder. He walked slowly, letting everyone pass him. He didn't need to hurry. He had time. And that's what made him different. Jake thought he was in charge, but Tony was playing a longer game. A smarter game. The tension was growing, like a rubber band stretching tighter and tighter. Jake kept pushing. Tony kept waiting. And every day, every little fight, brought them closer to the edge. The other kids didn't notice. The teachers didn't care. But it was there, simmering under the surface, ready to burst. Tony wasn't just a quiet kid anymore. He was a storm, brewing and building, and Jake had no idea he was about to get caught in it. Stick around, because this is only the beginning. Weeks passed at Westview Middle School, and things got worse for Tony Russo. Jake Miller, the big, mean 7th grader, didn't let up. He was like a storm that kept getting louder and stronger. Every day, he found new ways to pick on Tony. In the halls, where kids rushed to class with their backpacks bouncing, Jake would stick out his foot. Tony would trip, his book sliding across the floor with a loud thud. Kids would giggle and point, and Jake would laugh the loudest. "Watch where you're going, clumsy," he'd shout, high-fiving his friends like it was a game. Then there was the homework trouble. Tony worked hard on his assignments, scribbling answers in his notebook during recess while others played. But Jake didn't care. One day, he snatched Tony's math homework right off his desk before class. "Oops, I need this more than you," Jake said, grinning as he crumpled it into a ball and tossed it across the room. The teacher didn't see, and Tony didn't tell. He just sighed, pulled out a new sheet of paper, and started over. Jake thought it was hilarious. To him, Tony was a pushover, a kid who'd never fight back. The worst came at lunch one day. The cafeteria was buzzing with noise, trays clattering, kids shouting, the smell of pizza and gravy in the air. Tony sat alone, like always, with his lunch tray in front of him. He had mashed potatoes, a roll, and a little cup of applesauce. Jake marched over, his sneakers squeaking on the floor. Without a word, he smacked Tony's tray with his hand. It flipped over, crashing to the ground. Mashed potatoes splattered everywhere, sticking to Tony's jeans and the tiles. "Stay down, weirdo," Jake barked, his voice loud and sharp. The whole cafeteria roared with laughter, kids banging their fists on the tables and pointing at the mess. Tony didn't yell. He didn't cry. He didn't even look mad. He just stood up slowly, brushing the potatoes off his pants with his hands. The white mush smeared a little, but he didn't care. He picked up his tray, set it back on the table, and sat down again. His face stayed calm, but if you looked close, you'd see something. His hands curled into tight fists, just for a second. His jaw got stiff, like he was biting down hard. He didn't swing at Jake. He didn't shout back. But those little signs, those tiny clues showed he wasn't as weak as everyone thought. Jake didn't notice. He was too busy laughing, too busy acting like the king of the school. His friends cheered him on, calling Tony names like loser and freak. To them, it was all fun. They thought Tony was nothing, a quiet kid they could mess with forever. But they were wrong. Tony wasn't just sitting there taking it. He was watching. He was thinking. Every trip, every stolen paper, every ruined lunch, he kept it all in his head, like a list he'd never forget. And he wasn't just waiting anymore. He was starting to plan something big. Then, something strange happened. It started one afternoon after school. The bell rang, and kids poured out of the building, racing to buses or bikes. A shiny black car rolled up and parked near the school gates. It wasn't like the usual cars moms and dads drove. This one was sleek, with dark, tinted windows you couldn't see through. It looked fancy, too fancy for a place like Westview. The car just sat there, engine rumbling softly, and no one got out. Kids walking by slowed down, staring at it. "Who's that?" they whispered to each other. "Is it a movie star? A spy?" Nobody knew. The next day, the car was back. Same spot, same time. And the day after that, too. Soon, it was there every afternoon, waiting like a shadow. Kids started talking about it more. "Maybe it's a secret agent," one said. "Or someone rich," another guessed. They made up stories, giggling and pointing as they passed by. Tony didn't say anything about it. He'd walk out of school, his backpack slung over one shoulder, and glance at the car. Just a quick look, nothing big. Then he'd keep walking home, his hands in his pockets. He never told anyone what it meant. He didn't have to. Jake noticed the car too. It bugged him. He didn't like mysteries, he liked being the one in charge, the one who knew everything. One day, he caught up to Tony after school, right by the gates. The black car was there again, gleaming in the sunlight. Jake crossed his arms and smirked. "What's your deal, Russo?" he said, his voice loud and mean. "You got a secret chauffeur or something? What, are you a big shot now?" His friends snickered behind him, elbowing each other. They thought it was a great joke. Tony stopped walking. He turned his head a little, looking at Jake with those sharp, steady eyes. Maybe, he said simply. Then he shrugged and kept going. Jake blinked. Maybe, he repeated, mocking Tony's voice. What's that supposed to mean, huh? He laughed, but it sounded fake this time. His friends laughed too, but they didn't sound so sure either. Something about Tony's answer, short, calm, and not scared, made them feel funny. Jake shook it off and kicked a rock across the sidewalk. You're so weird, Russo, he muttered, turning away. But deep down, that car was starting to get under his skin. Who was it? Why was it there every day? And why did Tony look at it like he knew something? The bullies didn't know it yet, but time was ticking. Every day Jake tripped Tony, every time he stole something or knocked over his lunch, he was making a bigger mistake. Tony wasn't just taking notes in his head anymore, he was getting ready. He watched Jake like a hawk, noticing how he walked, how he talked, how he laughed. He saw the way Jake's friends followed him, like dogs chasing a bone. He heard every word they said, even the quiet ones. And that black car? It wasn't just a car. It was a hint, a tiny piece of the puzzle that Jake couldn't figure out. The tension was growing, like a balloon filling up with air. Jake kept pushing, thinking he was the toughest kid around. Tony kept waiting, quiet and still, like a cat before it pounces. The other kids didn't see it. They were too busy laughing or eating or playing. But it was there, bubbling under everything. Tony wasn't the weak kid they thought he was. He was something else, something dangerous. And Jake? He was running out of chances to figure it out. Every afternoon, Tony would leave school, glance at that shiny black car, and walk away. He didn't smile. He didn't frown. He just kept going, like nothing could stop him. The bullies thought they had all the power, but they were wrong. Tony was building something, a plan, a surprise, a moment that would change everything. And it was coming closer with every passing day. What was in that car? Who was waiting for Tony? Stick around, because you're about to find out. It all came crashing down on a Friday afternoon at Westview Middle School. The week had been rough. Jake Miller and his gang had been meaner than ever, picking on Tony Russo every chance they got. But this day? This day was different. The air felt heavy, like something big was about to happen. Kids were done with classes, spilling out onto the playground, ready for the weekend. The sun was still high, shining bright, and the gym building cast a long shadow across the grass. That's where it went down, behind the gym, away from the teacher's eyes. Jake and his crew had been waiting for this moment. They'd cornered Tony there, trapping him against the brick wall. Jake stood in front, tall and loud, cracking his knuckles like he was about to start a fight. His friends fanned out around him, making a half circle so Tony couldn't run. Other kids from school saw what was happening and hurried over, whispering and pointing. They wanted a show. Time to teach you a lesson, freak. Jake growled, his voice deep and mean. He rolled his shoulders, grinning like he'd already won. His spiky blonde hair glinted in the sunlight, and his eyes were narrow, full of mischief. Tony just stood there. He didn't run. He didn't shake. He didn't even look scared. His hands hung loose by his sides, and his messy black hair flopped over his forehead. He was too calm, way too calm for a kid about to get pounded. The crowd watched, holding their breath. Jake's friends smirked, nudging each other. They thought this was it, Tony was done for. Jake pulled his arm back and swung a fist, hard and fast, aiming right for Tony's face. But Tony moved. Quick as a flash, he ducked under the punch. Jake's fist hit nothing but air, and he stumbled forward, off balance. Before anyone could blink, Tony grabbed Jake's arm with both hands. He twisted it sharp and strong and shoved Jake down. Hard. Jake hit the ground with a loud thump, dirt puffing up around him. The crowd gasped, their eyes wide. What the? Jake sputtered, his voice all shaky. He scrambled to his feet, brushing grass off his shirt, his face red with shock. Tony stepped back, cool as ever. He flicked some dirt off his faded hoodie and looked at Jake. You done yet? He asked. His voice was low, steady, like he wasn't even mad. The kids around them went quiet, staring. Jake's friends stopped smirking. Nobody expected this, not from Tony, the quiet kid who never fought back. Jake stood there, breathing fast, his hands balled into fists. He didn't know what to say. For the first time, he looked unsure. And that's when it happened, the moment everything changed. A loud roar cut through the silence. Tires screeched on the pavement nearby, and heads turned. It was the black car, the shiny one that had been parking near the school every day. It sped right up to the edge of the playground, stopping so fast the gravel crunched under its wheels. The doors flew open with a bang, and 3 huge men stepped out. They were tall, way taller than any teacher, and they wore dark suits that looked fancy and scary at the same time. Their sunglasses hid their eyes, and their hair was slicked back, shiny like the car. They didn't smile. Their faces said trouble, loud and clear. The leader was the biggest. He was a giant, with shoulders like a football player and a long, jagged scar running across his cheek. It looked old, like a story carved into his skin. He took off his sunglasses, slow and deliberate, and stared straight at Jake. His eyes were cold, sharp, like they could cut through anything. The other 2 men stood behind him, arms crossed, watching. The crowd of kids went dead silent. Even the wind seemed to stop. "You the one messin' with my nephew," the giant boomed. His voice was deep, rumbling like thunder. It wasn't a question, it was a warning. Jake froze. His mouth dropped open, but no words came out. His face turned white, like all the color drained away. The kids around him stepped back, their sneakers scuffing the dirt. Nobody wanted to be near Jake right now, not with that guy glaring at him. Tony crossed his arms and grinned. It wasn't a shy smile or a little smirk this time, it was big, bold, and full of confidence. He looked at Jake, then nodded toward the giant. "Meet my uncle, Jake," he said, his voice clear and strong. "You might have heard of his boss, my dad. They call him the Shadow around here. Runs everything." Jake's knees wobbled. He tried to say something, anything, but his throat was dry. I didn't," he stammered, but the words fell apart. His friends backed away even more, their eyes darting between Tony and the men in suits. The crowd was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. Nobody laughed now. Nobody pointed. They just stared, mouths open, trying to believe what they were hearing. Tony's uncle took a step forward, his big boots crunching the grass. He didn't need to say much, his size and that scar said it all. He looked down at Jake like he was a bug he could squash. "You been picking on the wrong kid," he said, his voice low but heavy, like a truck rolling by. "Tony's family." "My family." "You don't touch family." Jake's hands shook. He looked at Tony, then at the giant, then back at Tony. "I didn't know," he blurted out, his voice high and squeaky. "I swear, I didn't know." He sounded like a little kid now, not the big, tough bully he'd been 5 minutes ago. Tony tilted his head, watching him squirm. "Yeah," he said simply. "You didn't." The other 2 men in suits didn't move, but they didn't have to. Just standing there, they made the air feel tight, like a storm was about to break. The kids in the crowd started whispering, their voices buzzing like bees. "Tony's dad is the Shadow," one said. "No way," said another. "That's why the car's been here." They were putting it together now, the black car, Tony's quiet ways, the way he never got mad. It all made sense. Jake took a step back, his sneakers slipping in the dirt. He looked like he wanted to run, but his legs wouldn't move. Tony's uncle didn't chase him. He didn't need to. The truth was out, and it was bigger than any punch Jake could throw. Tony wasn't just some lonely kid anymore. He was the son of the most powerful man in town, and Jake had just found out the hard way. Jake's hands shook. He stumbled back a step, his sneakers slipping on the grass. I am sorry, Tony," he stammered, his voice all wobbly and high. "I didn't know. I swear, I didn't know." He sounded like a scared little kid, not the big, tough bully who'd been running the school. His spiky blonde hair was messy now, sticking to his sweaty forehead. He kept looking from Tony to the giant, then back to Tony, like he couldn't believe this was real. The giant gave Jake one last long look, then turned to Tony. "You good, kid?" he asked, his deep voice rumbling. Tony nodded. "Yeah, Uncle Scar. I'm good." The giant smirked just a little and put his sunglasses back on. "Let's go," he said to the other men. They climbed into the black car without a word, the door slamming shut with a loud bang. The engine roared to life, and the car peeled out, tires kicking up dust as it sped away. The kids watched it go, their whispers starting up again, soft and fast like buzzing bees. Jake's friends, the bullies who'd followed him everywhere, were gone too. Not really gone, but they didn't stick together anymore. When Tony passed them in the hall, they scattered like leaves in the wind. One ducked into a classroom. Another pretended to tie his shoe. They didn't laugh or call names now. They didn't dare. Word had spread fast over the weekend, racing through texts and whispers. Tony Russo wasn't just some kid. He was untouchable. Mess with him, and you'd answer to the shadow. Nobody wanted that. The teachers noticed too. On Monday, when Tony walked into class, Mrs. Carter, the strict math teacher, smiled at him. She never smiled at anyone. "Good morning, Tony," she said, her voice extra nice. She even let him turn in his homework a day late, something she'd never done before. In the cafeteria, the lunch lady gave him an extra scoop of mashed potatoes without him asking. "Here you go, sweetie," she said, winking. It was like Tony had turned into royalty overnight. The grown-ups didn't say it out loud, but they knew something big had happened. They treated him different, careful, polite, like he was someone important. Tony didn't brag about any of it. He didn't walk around acting big or tough. He didn't tell stories about his dad or his uncle or the Mafia. He just went back to being quiet old Tony, the kid with the messy hair and the faded hoodie. He sat alone sometimes, watching the clouds or doodling in his notebook. But now, everyone saw him differently. They knew the truth hiding under that calm face. They knew who his family was. And they knew what happened to people who crossed him. Jake learned that lesson the hard way. By Tuesday, he was eating lunch alone. His old friends didn't sit with him anymore, they'd picked new groups, leaving him behind. Kids whispered when he walked by. "That's the guy who picked on Tony," they'd say, shaking their heads. Jake didn't talk back. He didn't try to be the boss anymore. Whatever Uncle Scar had whispered to him stuck in his brain like glue. He was done being the bully. He'd lost, and everyone could see it. Justice wasn't loud or messy. It didn't need fists or yelling. It came quiet and strong, like Tony himself. The bullies got what they deserved, not because they got hurt, but because they lost everything they'd built. Jake wasn't king of the school anymore. Tony didn't take his place, he didn't want it. But he'd shown them all, you can't judge a kid by his sneakers or his silence. Sometimes, the quiet ones have the biggest power. By the end of the week, things settled down. The black car didn't show up again, not for a while, but everyone remembered it. Tony walked through the halls, his backpack bouncing, and kids nodded at him like he was a hero. He didn't say much, just kept going his own way. But the message was clear: mess with Tony Russo, and you'd answer to the shadow. And nobody, not Jake, not his crew, not anyone, was dumb enough to try that again. The school was his now, not because he fought for it, but because he didn't have to. That's how justice worked this time: simple, strong, and final. What a wild ride, right? Stick around for the last part. Okay, let's wrap this up. So, what do you think about Tony's story? It's pretty wild, right? One day, he walked into Westview Middle School as a nobody, just a quiet kid with messy hair and holy sneakers. Nobody paid attention to him. They laughed at him, pushed him around, and thought he was nothing special. But by the end, Tony walked out a legend. Everyone knew his name. Everyone knew he wasn't just some loner, he was the son of the shadow, the toughest guy in town. It's crazy how fast things can change, isn't it? Think about it. Tony didn't look strong. He didn't act big or loud. He didn't go around telling everyone who his dad was or showing off his uncle's scary car. He stayed quiet, kept his head down, and let the bullies like Jake think they were in charge. But all along, Tony had something they didn't see. He had power inside him, hiding under that faded hoodie. Sometimes, the kid you think is weak turns out to be the strongest one there. Isn't that cool? It's like a secret superpower nobody expects. And what about Jake and his crew? They were the loudmouths, the ones picking fights, laughing the loudest, acting like they owned the school. Jake thought he could push Tony around forever. He tripped him, stole his stuff, dumped his lunch on the floor, and called him names. He was so sure he'd win every time. But when the truth came out, when Tony's uncle showed up and Jake found out who Tony really was, everything flipped. Those loudmouths crashed hard. Jake went from king of the playground to a kid nobody wanted to sit with. The truth hit him like a big, heavy brick, and he couldn't dodge it. That's what happens when you judge people too fast. You might end up looking silly when they surprise you. Tony didn't need to yell or brag to win. He just waited, watched, and let the truth do the work. That's a cool way to be strong, right? You don't always have to be the loudest or the toughest looking to show what you're made of. Sometimes, staying calm and smart is the best kind of power. Jake learned that the hard way. He thought being big and mean made him the boss, but it didn't. Tony showed him that real strength doesn't need a spotlight. It just shows up when it's time, and then everyone sees it. This makes me wonder about you, too. Have you ever met someone who seemed super quiet but turned out to be really cool? Maybe a friend who didn't talk much but did something amazing one day? Or maybe you're the quiet one with a big story nobody knows yet. That's the fun part about people. Everyone's got something special inside, even if it's hiding. You don't have to be loud or flashy to matter. Tony proved that. He was just himself, and that was enough to turn the whole school upside down. So, next time you see someone getting picked on or ignored, think about Tony. Maybe they're not weak. Maybe they're just waiting for the right moment to shine. And if you're ever the one feeling small or left out, remember this: you've got your own power, even if nobody sees it yet. It's there, waiting for its chance. You don't need a mafia boss dad or a scary uncle to be strong. You just need to be you. That's pretty inspiring, huh? Thanks for sticking with me through this wild ride. Tony's story started with a sunny morning and a goofy walk, and it ended with a big, jaw-dropping twist. I hope you liked it as much as I liked telling it. What did you think? Did it make you cheer for Tony? Did it make you laugh when Jake got scared? Drop a comment below. I'd love to hear from you. Oh, and if you enjoyed this, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next one. There's always more fun stuff coming your way.